Jasmine Crockett walked into Congress for a closed-door hearing about presidential ethics. But instead of questions about policy, she dropped a truth no one saw coming. Donald Trump may have hidden the real story of his own son's identity. With court-sealed documents, a suspicious DNA clause in his marriage contract, and a woman long forced into silence, Jasmine didn't just accuse. She revealed. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about blood, power, and a secret buried for 24 years. What if the child meant to inherit everything, was never his to begin with? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The room was too quiet for a congressional hearing. Thick doors sealed out the world, no press, no cameras, just guarded glances and stale coffee. The official agenda read, Ethical Oversight of Executive Conduct. But everyone knew this wasn't about ethics, it was a formality. Donald Trump sat at the center, surrounded by lawyers and aides like a fortress of silk ties and steel stairs. His arms were folded, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the room with contempt, as if none of it mattered. Around him, members of the committee shuffled papers, pretended to be busy, passed jokes under their breath. One Democrat yawned. A Republican murmured about the air conditioning. Nobody expected a fight, just another forgettable session before lunch. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't said a word. She sat at the far end of the panel, completely still, watching. Not blinking, not moving, not even writing. For 40 minutes, she didn't lean in, didn't whisper, didn't reach for water. She watched Trump the way a surgeon watches a pulse waiting for the right second to cut. Her fingers rested on a slim folder in her lap, untouched, zipped. Everyone else thought she was bored, but Jasmine was counting. The room filled with empty rhetoric while she studied every breath, every glance, every defense before it was raised. Then, without warning, she stood. Mr. Chairman, she said, and her voice cut clean through the noise. The murmurs stopped. Geller looked up, confused. Yes, Representative Crockett, he asked almost casually. I request the room be sealed, she said. Doors locked, phones off, all cameras disabled. Several heads turned at once. A few people sat forward, confused, unsure whether she was joking. She wasn't. This hearing, she continued, is about the character of the office, and what I'm about to say doesn't belong in a headline. It belongs behind closed doors where accountability starts. One of Trump's lawyers whispered fast, visibly tense. But Crockett didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, as if the only person in the room was him. The chairman hesitated. Then slowly he nodded. Officers moved to lock the doors. Recording lights blinked off one by one. The room went cold. Phones were surrendered into manila envelopes. Crockett stepped away from the table, unzipped the red folder she hadn't touched all morning. Her hand hovered over the first page. She looked straight at Trump, not with hatred, but with precision. Then she said it, without raising her voice, without theatrics. I'm not here to talk about law. I'm here to talk about the oath. The silence after that didn't feel procedural. It felt like a countdown had just begun. The silence that followed Jasmine's words felt heavier than before. Not just quiet, but loaded, like a fuse that had just been lit. The phrase, the oath, wasn't loud, but it landed like a gavel. Something cracked beneath the surface of the room. No one could name it yet, but everyone felt it. The mood had changed. This was no longer about oversight or ethics. This wasn't a discussion, it was a confrontation. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but she had raised the stakes. Without looking left or right, she slid the red folder open with precise calm. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were locked on Donald Trump like crosshairs. She didn't fumble, didn't hesitate. She reached in, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and placed it face down in front of her, like a chess move that would kill the king. The paper looked ordinary, but every eye in the room saw it for what it really was, a loaded weapon wrapped in legal formatting. No preamble, no buildup. Jasmine leaned in and asked, her voice clear, sharp, undeniable. Mr. Trump, did you ever submit to a paternity test during your presidency? For a second, it was like the room forgot how to breathe. Trump didn't flinch at first. He leaned back slowly in his chair, wearing the same smirk he used on debate stages and courtroom steps. "Excuse me?" he replied, chuckling like it was beneath him. "What kind of circus is this?" The laugh came easy, but the timing was off. His lawyer stiffened before he even finished the sentence. They'd heard that tone before, the kind Trump used when cornered but trying to bluff through. His smirk cracked at the edges. The color in his face didn't change all at once. It pulled away in slow retreat, like heat leaving a room. His fingers flexed slightly, like they were searching for control. Jasmine stood still, no emotion on her face, just focus. The kind of focus that only comes when someone already knows the answer, but wants the world to hear the lie. She didn't move closer. She didn't raise her voice, but the pressure in the room tightened like a vice. "I'll ask again, sir," she said, calm as before. "Did you ever take a paternity test while in office?" Trump blinked, not slowly, sharply, like a reflex. His jaw moved, but no words came out. He looked at his lead attorney for help, but the man didn't speak. The room wasn't giving him room to breathe. Crockett didn't wait for an answer. She reached out, pulled the document back toward her, and said the line that broke the tension in half. "If you won't answer," she said, "then I'll read it aloud." The silence that followed her words didn't break, it hardened. Jasmine didn't look up as she turned the page over, slow and deliberate, letting the golden seal from Maricopa County catch the overhead light. It gleamed like a bullet casing. No one breathed. Even the hum of the ventilation seemed to disappear. "This request was filed in 2019, she said, her voice even, precise, each word cutting through the stillness like glass. "It was submitted to the Maricopa County Family Court, and it was real." She didn't blink. It was an official petition demanding a court-ordered paternity test from the President of the United States. Her fingers slid the document down the polished table, stopping right in front of Chairman Geller. The recipient of the request was the sitting President of the United States, and his response wasn't denial, it was silence. She turned, eyes locked on Trump again. He never complied. The effect was immediate. William Overby, Trump's lead attorney, snapped forward in his seat. His tie shifted as he leaned on the table, voice sharp with panic. "Madam Chair, this line of questioning." But Jasmine didn't blink. She cut through his interruption like a blade. "Is fully within the scope of this hearing." The force in her tone stunned even Geller, who didn't move a muscle. No one objected. No one dared. She returned her focus to the committee, to the room that had now transformed from a chamber of politics into a court of reckoning. "What happened next," she said coldly, "was that the entire paternity test request was immediately sealed 72 hours after submission under an emergency classification labeled National Security Risk." She lifted a second page, this one stamped with the dark watermark of Homeland Security, as if it had been pulled straight from a vault. "Let's be honest. Asking for a DNA test doesn't threaten national security, but protecting a legacy? That might be." The sentence lingered like smoke from a gun that had just fired. Lawyers on Trump's team erupted all at once. 3 of them leaned across the table, throwing out objections like lifelines. Inadmissible, irrelevant, personal attack, outside jurisdiction. Their words collided midair, loud but directionless, a desperate wall of noise. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let them yell for a few seconds, unmoved, expression unreadable. She turned slightly toward Geller and asked, clear and cold as glass, "Do I still have the floor?" His hesitation spoke volumes, but he nodded once as if the weight of history was on his shoulders. "Proceed," he said softer than before. Jasmine nodded back calmly. Then she reached into her bag. The movement was slow but deliberate, like someone reaching for a detonator. No rustle, no stumble. Just the sound of a zipper opening and then the quiet appearance of something none of them had expected to see. A red envelope. No logo, no label, no air left in the room. It didn't need an explanation. Everyone in that chamber knew what it meant. Red was reserved for classified evidence, too dangerous to leave lying around. Her hand didn't tremble. She set it down with almost no sound, but somehow the table felt heavier beneath it. The envelope glowed against the dull wood grain, vivid and final. No one dared speak, and in that terrifying quiet, a single truth landed unspoken. They weren't here to speculate anymore. They were here to expose what had already been buried. The envelope sat in the center of the table like a detonator. Jasmine didn't touch it at first. She let it breathe. The kind of silence that comes just before something irreversible happens. Then, with a single motion steady, practiced, she broke the seal. Her hands didn't shake. They didn't need to. The energy in the room was doing all the trembling for her. From the red paper, she pulled out a single document. Heavyweight stock, cream-colored, legal formatting, gold-trimmed edges. She held it like it weighed more than it should have and gently laid it flat for all to see. "This," she began, her voice cool and exact, "is the revised prenuptial agreement between Donald J. Trump and Melania Nouse Trump, signed in 2005. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't have to. Even before she spoke again, the air had shifted. Some aides leaned forward, others back. Everyone was still. Jasmine reached toward the bottom of the page, where a small, single-spaced paragraph had been highlighted. Her finger paused on the clause like a scalpel choosing where to cut. Then she read it out loud, no tremor, no hesitation. "In the event the child is not biologically related to either party, both agree not to pursue paternity testing under any circumstance unless mutually consented." She didn't explain it. She didn't need to. That line sat there like a confession. What kind of couple drafts a clause like that? What were they protecting or hiding that required a legal promise not to ask biological questions? Jasmine gave it a full beat of silence, letting the sentence rot in everyone's ears. Then she said calmly, "This clause was removed." Her eyes stayed fixed on Trump. It existed for exactly 47 seconds before being redacted from the final version. Murmurs rippled like static at the edge of an explosion. But that 47 seconds was enough. She reached again this time, sliding a second sheet of paper across the table. A hotel concierge assigned to log high-profile documents for scanning and security made a copy before the change was finalized. Time-stamped, digitally archived, witnessed. Her words were landing like bullets. And that's when Trump erupted. He launched out of his chair like a man thrown by fire. "Don't you bring my wife into this!" His voice boomed off the paneled walls, raw and furious. His fists clenched, eyes wide with rage or something worse. His lawyer tried to grab his sleeve, but Trump shook him off, like a man drowning who didn't want to be saved. His face was flushed deep red now, not from exertion, but from the unbearable exposure of something once buried. His outburst wasn't about Melania. It was about the clause, about what it might reveal, about what it was designed to prevent from ever being revealed. But Jasmine didn't flinch, not an inch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. She let him shout, let the heat burn the room, and when the silence finally returned, thin and trembling, she answered. "I'm not bringing her into anything," she said, low and lethal. "I'm just reading what you signed." It was a reply that didn't just shut him down, it cut the oxygen from the room. Like a trapdoor opening beneath decades of silence. Like truth walking in with a spotlight. Jasmine didn't lean forward. She didn't gesture. She just sat still, letting the words hang like the end of a verdict. Everyone heard them. No one could unhear them. Trump didn't sit back down. He just stood there, like a man who realized too late that the past he buried had learned how to breathe again. The silence was still ringing when Jasmine pulled out the next set of documents, slim, clinical, and deadly. They weren't headlines. They weren't rumors. They were emails, dated, time-stamped, and sent directly to the White House legal liaison inbox in early May 2019. Jasmine placed the first page flat on the table, letting the black ink do the talking. "These are communications from a registered pediatric nurse," she said. "Her identity remains protected, but she worked at a private children's facility in Scottsdale, Arizona. These emails were not casual. They were urgent." She held up the first message. The subject line read in bold, "Urgent, child medical assistance, request, private." Jasmine's voice was steady, slicing the air like a scalpel. This nurse wrote requesting immediate authorization for financial assistance for a minor under temporary guardianship. The child's biological parentage had come into question. The mother, whose name is redacted, couldn't cover the cost of full-panel paternity testing. The nurse was attempting to submit the sample through official White House channels, since, according to her words, and I quote, The alleged father is a federal official with direct executive security access. Jasmine looked up slowly. That's not a guess. That's her exact phrasing. Murmurs broke across the back row. One aide shifted in his seat, trying to look away from the page now burning into his eyes. Jasmine continued. The nurse explicitly asked for expedited approval of testing through the National Institutes of Health or any authorized military-grade lab, given the sensitive nature of the identity involved. She added that the child's health would be at risk if clarity wasn't reached soon. Not for medical reasons, Jasmine tapped the line with her finger, but for safety. She paused. What happened next? She flipped to the second email, sent 3 days later. The tone was more anxious. She hadn't received a response. In this follow-up, she resubmitted the request and asked whether the office of the president had denied the paternity link. She asked whether she should destroy the sample. Jasmine looked up again. That's a nurse asking whether she should make this disappear. Trump's face didn't move, but the muscle in his jaw twitched hard. Jasmine placed the final email in the center. It was dated May 19th. Subject line, sample reroute confirmation received Red Lantern Diagnostics. Jasmine spoke even slower now. The sample never went to NIH, never to Walter Reed, never to any federal institution. It was redirected to a non-existent lab, Red Lantern Diagnostics, which, for the record, is registered under veterinary services and shut down since 2017. Her words dropped like a trapdoor opening. This was not an error. This was a plan. She pulled out the last page, an internal authorization memo. 1 signature, 2 initials. DJT Trump didn't flinch. He didn't speak. The silence this time wasn't confusion. It was cornered instinct. And then Jasmine dropped the hammer. You buried the truth to protect your image. 1 sentence, 1 execution. No rebuttal, no rescue. Just a man, a paper trail, and a truth too big to unsee. The silence that followed Jasmine's last line wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The kind that presses against your chest and makes the room feel too small, too still. The kind that doesn't wait for applause because no one is clapping, they're holding their breath. Eyes darted, but no one moved. No cameras clicked. No aides whispered. Every inch of the chamber froze in place like something sacred or dangerous had just been exposed. Jasmine didn't lean into the moment. She didn't milk it. She simply reached forward with the precision of a surgeon, sliding 1 final sheet of paper out of her folder as if it were a scalpel. It was thin, almost brittle, creased from being folded too many times. She unfolded it slowly and deliberately, then laid it flat on the table with both hands. Her voice came low, sharp, unshakable. This, she said, is a court fax. The words weren't flashy, but their weight sent a ripple through the air like a detonation muffled by velvet. She didn't need to announce it louder. She only needed to be exact. From the Maricopa County Family Court, Phoenix, Arizona, she said, tapping the seal in the upper corner. Dated September 4th, 2019, addressed directly to the Executive Liaison Office at the White House. Her tone was calm, almost clinical, but every syllable struck like a gavel. Trump's team barely blinked, but they weren't writing anything down. They weren't even pretending anymore. They were waiting, praying, maybe that whatever was coming next wouldn't be what they feared. Then Jasmine read the words, not dramatically, not with emphasis, just clearly, surgically. Client JDT refused DNA testing. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. A low gasp from the far left corner of the chamber was immediately silenced by a sideways glance from a staffer. But the damage was already done. Trump didn't shift in his chair, but the color in his face dropped a full shade. His eyes darted not toward Jasmine, but toward his attorney, who stared straight ahead like he was trying not to exist. Jasmine let the silence linger for a beat. Then she flipped to the next line, letting the room feel the dissent 1 sentence at a time. Client proposes sealed settlement in lieu of testing. No public filing. No federal oversight. She looked up, and only then did she speak again, not as a question, but as a conclusion. Not only was the test refused, it was buried. The word hit like concrete. Someone shifted behind Trump. Another staffer dropped their pen, but didn't dare pick it up. Even the chairs seemed to stop creaking. Jasmine placed her palm gently on the facts, as if anchoring the truth in front of her. This isn't speculation. It's a documented exchange between a state-level judicial body and the highest executive office in the nation. Her gaze swept across the room. And the only response? Silence. Not denial, not evidence. Silence. Followed by a proposal to seal it all away, out of the public eye, out of reach. Trump's breathing was visible now. Not theatrical, just real. Shallow, fast, uncontrolled. His jaw twitched slightly. A vein on his neck pulsed. His left hand, previously resting calmly on the table, had curled into a fist. But he said nothing. Not a word. Because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't collapse the wall he'd spent decades building. Jasmine stayed locked in, her voice now quieter, but far more dangerous. A woman filed, a child was named, a question was raised, and instead of truth, the system received a proposal for silence. Then she stood. It wasn't grand or slow motion. It wasn't meant for headlines or television. It was meant for impact. Jasmine Crockett rose with a stillness that held more force than a shout ever could. Her presence alone made the room feel smaller. You didn't just decline, she said, voice level. You redirected. You hid. You shielded yourself behind bureaucracy and influence, using silence as a sword and secrecy as armor. Trump looked up at her, and in that single glance, tense, tired, cornered, the illusion of power began to rupture. No longer the man in control, no longer the deal maker or the performer, just a man sitting in a room full of facts he could no longer escape. The members of the ethics committee were silent. The aides behind them had frozen in place. Even those normally loyal to Trump had lost their reflex to defend. This wasn't a political argument anymore. It was something deeper, more human. The truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was undeniable. Then Jasmine reached forward and adjusted the microphone in front of her, though she barely needed it. Her voice had cut through clearer without amplification than any speaker ever could. She looked directly at Trump, not to humiliate, but to hold accountable. And that's when she delivered the line. If you have nothing to hide, she asked, then why are you afraid of the test? There it was. A single sentence. No spin, no accusation. Just a question, and yet it sounded like a sentence. It didn't just pierce the room, it pinned it. No one moved, because in that moment, everyone, every committee member, every aide, every guard at the door knew the hearing had shifted. This wasn't about legalities. This wasn't about procedure. This was about a man running out of places to hide. A man who could silence the press, buy off networks, bury court records, but could not erase the look in his eyes right now. And Trump? He sat there, not blinking, not speaking, sweat now running in a slow stream behind his right ear. His hand reached slightly under the table, not to grab a pen, but to steady himself. And still he said nothing. Because the only thing more damning than saying the wrong words was saying none at all. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just returned to her seat with the same controlled precision she had maintained since the beginning. And behind her, the echo of her question lingered, not because it was shouted, but because it no longer needed to be answered. It already had been. The hearing chamber seemed to exhale all at once when the gavel fell. It wasn't applause. It was the heavy exhale of shock. Chaos simmered behind porcelain doors moments later. Trump rose abruptly, chair screeching a jagged punctuation to the tension inside. His aides swarmed him, voices hushed but frantic, guiding him down a carpeted hallway, away from blinking lights and silent witnesses. The fluorescent glow underfoot made shadows more rigid, more suspicious. Phones buzzed inside his pocket, text alerts, secure lines, lawyer memos, but Trump ignored them all. He focused only on reaching a small, windowless conference room reserved for senior counsel. The door clicked shut, and then it was silent. Not the calm of resolution, but the freeze of realization. They had walked from spectacle into a storm of their own making. Inside, the air felt differently charged, staler. Trump stood rigid, hands clenched at his sides. Papers lay flat on the table like casualties. Tear sheet drafts, legal protocols, damage control scripts nobody dared utter. He emptied his lungs once, sharply, then spoke in a clipped tone. I want to know who gave her those documents. The words trembled on his tongue like a confession. His chief of staff inhaled sharply, as if bracing for blame. A legal advisor tapped red ink notes against an unopened binder. No one answered immediately. They looked at each other, at their own trembling hands, at the ceiling sconces. They avoided his gaze, because admitting even hesitation would mean admitting the walls were closing in. Then his phone buzzed a secure call. Without looking, Trump picked it up. In seconds, the screen registered, "Melania, secure video." He pressed accept. Behind him, aides paused mid-gesture. Trump's face lost color. He swallowed, and adjusted his posture as though pulling himself together would fix what lay beyond the screen. Melania appeared, calm, composed, yet tired. Her backdrop was muted. A darkened suite in Geneva, distant, diplomatic, unreachable. But in her voice was a tremor, fragile like cracked glass. "You told me this was handled. This was over." Her words hung between them, heavy. Trump exhaled, slow and hollow. "It was," he replied. Then, "It was." There was a split-second pause. She waited, and then, softer, she said, "Then why is Jasmine carving your name into history?" His jaw locked. His eyes closed once. He opened his mouth, then shut it. The line clicked to signal dead. That click echoed in the small room like a judge's gavel. And in that instant, a senior aide stepped forward, voice low enough to register as confession. "She's not defaming. She's got the paperwork." His words zipped around the table like sparks. "She's not smearing you with rumors. She files it with receipts." The aide's breath caught at the last word. "If she has proof, anyone here can lose everything." Trump looked at him, then nodded once barely. The silence afterward cracked like glass hitting concrete. They stood there, a group of seemingly powerful people, suddenly small. One aide shuffled sheets as though counting lifelines. Another bit his lip. Trump paced slowly, hand brushing against the leather of the chair, as if mapping out his next move. Eyes downcast, he stared at the scatter of documents, shredded logic in ink and paper. Another aide leaned in, whispering strategy outlines and redactions. But the word Photoshop sounded ridiculous now. The document trail that had been dismissed for months was now broadcast into their private fortress. They wanted control, but control had left the room. Outside that conference room door, Capitol security stood guard, unnoticed. There was no camera inside, no recorder, no press. Just cold walls carrying the muffled thunder of a storm their boss had walked them into. Screens on aides' phones flashed updates, external whispers, text leaks already rolling out. But they were locked behind walls, sealed. They could hear nothing from the hearing chamber. They could only feel its pull. Trump sat, finally, like a man asked to sign a confession he couldn't contest. His team circled him, lawyers, press strategists, advisors. None dared raise their voices. Protocols lined the table. Charts, pipeline memos about crisis statements, silencers for leaks. He leaned over, scanning each document like it was a map marking every misstep. The room was silent except for his slow, heavy breathing. His face in that moment said more than any speech could. Doubts, fear, regret. Time slowed, as if every second haunted them. Trump finally broke the silence. He cleared his throat dry, echoing. "We need to go back." His voice cracked slightly. "We can't let her finish." He glanced at his lead attorney, words few but urgent. "Find out where the documents came from. Who accessed them? I want names, emails, everything." The attorney scribbled notes but didn't raise his head. Trump leaned back, eyes at the ceiling as if drawing power from somewhere remote. "We contain it by pushing forward," he said, lifeless, and an aide nodded, assuring him they were already drafting legal motions. But they all knew something deeper had shifted. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. He cleared his throat again, voice steadier but distant. "We're going live in 20 minutes, he said. "Prepare a statement." There was no clock on the wall, but someone checked their phone. No cameras, no reporters. Just the preamble to a firestorm they would now ignite on their own terms. Melania had hung up. Trump's inner circle inhaled collectively. They were the only audience. And every one of them were now characters in a play they wished they hadn't entered. That's when the aide who'd spoken earlier leaned in again, almost tenderly. "We still have the receipts," he whispered. His tone wasn't defiant, it was resigned. "But she's got them in her hands." The words settled heavy in the room like thunder before lightning. Trump exhaled slowly, fixed on nothing. The war drums had already been heard. Shields didn't exist. Strategies were hollow. He had lost control of the narrative the moment Jasmine opened her folder, and as the aide's voice lingered, "She's not smearing you with rumor, she files it with receipts." It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a verdict. And outside, the hearing resumed, unaware that the real trial had begun in the West Wing. The corridors of power were humming when Jasmine's phone buzzed again, but this time, the energy shifted. A single message shattered more than silence. "I'm ready." The sender's name read, Genevieve Larson. Jasmine felt her chest tighten, not in fear, but in understanding. This was no anonymous tip. This was the source itself stepping forward. A woman who had carried a secret imposed by contracts, by settlements, by fear. A woman whose truth had been suppressed by attorneys, money transfers, and sealed documents. For years, she had been paid to stay silent, to pretend that a child belonged to someone he plainly did not. And now, she was stepping into the light with a short sentence no one could ignore. Jasmine texted back, "Meet me now. Secure location." Minutes later, they stood in a nondescript office below the Capitol. No press, no cameras, no legal aids. Genevieve entered quietly, folder in hand, posture rigid but resolute. No tears, no camera angles. Just one determined pair of eyes. Jasmine escorted her to a small table. They sat facing each other, but only documents lay between them. This was no photo op. This was quiet revolution. Genevieve opened her manila envelope. A chain of documents poured out, each one weightier than the next. First, she placed the original DNA verification report, thick, stamped, unredacted. The test covered full autosomal markers, the standard for legal paternity claims. The name Baron William Trump appeared top line, followed by a two-line outcome. No detectable match at 0.0% probability. The result itself would crush illusions. Jasmine stared, but did not flinch. She leaned in, holding the printed DNA report up under the fluorescent hum. It wasn't unsigned. It wasn't contested. It looked like a verdict. Next came the financial settlement agreement, convoluted legal language, appendices and countersigned pages. But one clause glittered in bold. This settlement binds the signer to no future claims, including but not limited to genetic lineage, guardianship, or public commentary on paternity. That single sentence wasn't a payment, it was a straitjacket. A promise written between lines that said, "If you speak, you pay." Jasmine flipped through Adeno-coded settlement refs, disguised as health grants. Periodic payments marked prenatal indemnity. The entire contract was built on legal and financial intimidation. The mother Genevieve had accepted it, out of fear, out of survival. But now the document had become evidence of a lie structured for decades. Then Genevieve pulled out a small, matte black USB drive. She placed it carefully in front of Jasmine, like a bomb placed under glass. "Listen," she said in a measured voice. The room fell into an unnecessary hush. Nobody dared breathe. Jasmine plugged the drive into a secure playback device. The audio began. A lawyer's voice, authoritative, formal, clipped. "You were paid for silence. Any mention of that child's biological background must cease. Any medical documentation is to be destroyed. Keep the optics clean." The voice paused on the message, then continued. "If this becomes public, legal consequences will be swift." The final lines dripped with veiled threats wrapped in legal jargon. Underneath it, even the air in the room trembled. Jasmine did not cry. She did not recoil. She just stared at Genevieve, whose eyes glistened but did not water. Genevieve exhaled slowly, her first full breath in years. Unguarded, unpunished, unafraid. She reached out and gently acknowledged Jasmine. "Thank you for standing up." Jasmine stood, stepped closer, and reached across the table. No cameras, no round table, just steel and resolution. "Thank you for being brave," she said. Their hands didn't touch, but the moment did. They left the room separately. Jasmine returned to the hearing chamber with the envelope only now. The evidence had a pulse. Trump still sat in chaos beyond closed doors, dealing with broken control. But now the strength shifted. The dossier Genevieve delivered would not be dismissed. Not this time. And as Jasmine entered the chamber again, no one would underestimate what it meant when she said, "I have the mother with the evidence." When Jasmine stepped out of that secure room, something fundamental had shifted. The air in the Capitol's corridors felt heavier, electric with consequence. The hearing room beyond the locked doors waited, but now so did truth. The heavy oak doors swung open first to silence. Not the kind you expect in a courtroom, but the kind you feel before a storm. Trump was still seated, back straight, expression blank. He didn't stand or acknowledge her return. Jasmine paused at the threshold, letting her gaze scan the chamber committee members, half rising in curiosity. Aides leaning forward, pens hovering over pads. Past the front row, glimmers of phones were motioning undertyped messages. Then she walked forward. Steps slow, deliberate. She held the manila envelope steady, black ink on cream heavier than any gavel. Every eye in the room locked on it long before it reached the table. She laid it down directly before the Ethics Committee chair and the Department of Justice counsel by his side. No ceremony, no apology, just placement and wait. A member of the committee cleared his throat. Some politicians tremble when they speak. Not this one. He was stern. "Are you passing over all of this testimony, gene testing, financial records, audio?" Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She nodded once, sharply, yes. That nod seemed to crack the tension. "Madam President," he asked, softer this time, not accusatory but afraid, "you want us to bury this entire family's reputation?" Silence bloomed. The kind of quiet that isn't absence, it's anticipation. One staffer adjusted his glasses. Trump leaned back. No one blinked. No one breathed noticeably. Only Jasmine moved again just slightly. "I'm not going to bury anyone," she said. Her voice was calm, measured but precise, like a spotlight snapping on. "I'm just turning on the light." That line didn't just answer, it illuminated. Truth isn't about erasing. It's about revealing. And she just hit the switch. She didn't wait for applause. There wasn't any. Instead, she reached into her bag again, pulled a second folder, this one marked Ethics Committee, Archive Copy, and placed it beside the first. Then she set her notes on top of the table, neatly aligning them, all visible. The press would have their snapshots soon enough. Trump sat frozen. He didn't rise. No gasp, no statement, no walk of shame. Just a man who seemed to shrink in place, suffocated by silence, not from external applause, but from internal recognition. Her footsteps echoed as she returned to her seat. The chamber felt physically smaller now, tighter. The walls had heard something they couldn't unhear. Members exchanged glances. Some were trying to piece together explosions. Others were scanning their phones. Congressional aides scribbled again, but this time they wrote names. The logic was no longer about policy infringements. Now it was about broken trust. The floor felt electrified. Even the gavel seemed lighter, less convinced it could hold things together. Trump leaned forward, pressing both palms onto the desk. His eyes darted to the envelope, then up at Jasmine. He looked older, less practiced, more exposed. A lawyer reached for his elbow, but he waved them off. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. He couldn't because her line turned the room's dynamic upside down. It was no longer about defense or spin. It was about damage control. The query was simple. Are you afraid of the test? Now the question had sharpened to, are you afraid of exposure? Another committee member, younger, with less patience for drama, but more need for clarity, piped up. Representative Crockett, are you demanding further testimony in public session? Jasmine looked at her notes, quick, decisive. I am asking for transparency, she replied. All witnesses who handled these documents. All staff who managed the affidavits. That includes those who marked files confidential or sealed. When she said those words, the chamber swallowed once hard. That ask wasn't token. It was seismic. It meant subpoenas. It meant oversight. It meant hearings. And Trump no longer had the luxury of invisible rooms. By now, committee aides were discreetly exchanging lists, pre-writing motions. The room's clock ticked in real time, a metronome for accountability. Trump's breathing had slowed, but it wasn't relief. It was strategy, electric under anxiety. Meanwhile, Jasmine silently reviewed her folder, checking first the envelope, then searching her notes. She didn't glance at him, not once. Her posture was one of patience. She had done this before pulling reveals, but this time, the ammunition was mother-delivered, signed, witness-backed. Not rumors, not innuendo, not speculation, crystal-clear documentation. And now it rested before impartial authority. Because justice wasn't about jury or verdict, it was about transparency and truth. Member after member leaned in, making notes, marking quotes, studying receipts. No one dared speak next until Jasmine allowed herself to break the quiet. She rose again, not to leave, but to conclude the moment with finality. She remarked simply, "Every document here is public record. I stand behind each page, and I trust the oversight process to handle what follows." That wasn't courage. That was conviction. Then she turned back toward President Trump, not as adversary, but as keeper of truth. She nodded politely and walked out. When the gavel struck to resume the hearing, the momentum in the room had changed. It was no longer a staged inquiry. It had become a struggle for transparency, for truth, for accountability. Jasmine's envelope lay on that table like a spark before wildfire, and in the hush that followed, everyone knew. This inquiry wasn't over. It was just beginning. When Jasmine walked out of the hearing room, the chamber didn't close, it trembled. She returned to her office not as a victor celebrating a win, but as someone who had set a spark that hadn't gone out yet. She didn't call a press conference. She didn't post victory tweets. She didn't release a public statement. She simply moved back into her office, closed the door, and sat silently behind her desk. The manila envelope remained sealed, tucked in a drawer, important, not performative. Staffers peeked in occasionally but found no fanfare. Instead, they found Jasmine working just like any other day, reading bills, meeting constituents, preparing her morning notes. After weeks of chaos and drama, she chose ordinary, quiet normalcy. That was the message. Not gloating, not glory, just steadfastness built from facts. Meanwhile, Genevieve wrote a letter short, sharp, and filled with conviction. "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just telling the truth." She sent it to major news outlets and human rights journalists. No photos, no video, just text. It landed on desks as quietly as a confession, but echoed like a verdict. The letter explained she was stepping forward not for attention, but for accountability. She demanded no spotlight. She asked only that her words be heard. And across the nation, readers paused. Offline and online debates surged. But Jasmine? She didn't share the letter. She only nodded once during a late-night call from reporters who wanted a reaction. Then she thanked Geneva for her courage and closed her phone, ready to work. 1 month later, quietly with no press briefing, Donald John Trump announced he was withdrawing from the political race. No speech, no parade, no dramatic farewell. Just a tweet, short, polite, cryptic. Media didn't notice at first. Then they did. Analysts scrambled, journalists reached out, but no official statement followed. His team confirmed it as personal reasons and strategic withdrawal. But inside the West Wing and his campaign war rooms, the word wasn't strategy. The word was defeat from evidence that could not be unsaid, not spin that could not be rewritten. In the weeks after, visitors to Jasmine's office saw a new quote plastered on her glass door in bold letters. "I was not elected to protect someone's reputation. I was elected to protect the truth." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't there to persuade visitors or to charm tour groups. It was there as a daily reminder, firm and unyielding, of what she stood for. Staffers used it to connect with constituents. Other lawmakers paused when passing by. Some scoffed, some nodded, but everyone noticed it. Jasmine's days returned to regular cadence hearings, drafting legislation, constituent calls. The drama had passed, but the change remained. Ethics committees quietly reopened investigations. Some aides who once shuffled papers for Trump were recalled for interviews. Donors shifted their allegiance. Key leaders publicly acknowledged they had underestimated Jasmine Crockett. Her silence was not uncertainty, it was confidence. In press reports a week after Trump's withdrawal, Geneva's letter was quoted verbatim. Headlines read, "Mother speaks, I'm not afraid anymore." In a column, a former campaign strategist wrote, "This wasn't a smear campaign, it was documentation. She didn't wage a war, she presented a file." And in op-ed pages across the country, comparisons were made not to scandals that faded, but to moments that changed institutions. For a new generation, the phrase on Jasmine's door became a mantra: truth over image. One reporter asked Jasmine in an elevator what she thought about the nation's reaction. She looked at her reflection in the brass and said, "I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. That's why I didn't give her spotlight. I gave truth its space." And with that, the elevator doors slid open in silence. While the political world outside reset, Jasmine Crockett continued working on a bill she believed would prevent this ever happening again. It was simple: a statute requiring that sealed agreements involving public figures and children must be reviewed by independent legal counsel. No gag clause could override legal ethics. Not immediately passed, but filed. Months later, Congress still debated it, but the argument had changed. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about protecting future victims of silence. Occasionally, visitors told Jasmine they came to her door because of that quote, and she simply said, "I didn't come here to guard reputations. I came here to illuminate truths even when they burn." Inside her office, that message remained: unapologetic, unhiding, unstoppable. The door to Jasmine's office stayed open that night, but she didn't leave. The lights stayed on. The quote on her door was no longer a warning, it was a mirror. Because the truth, once spoken aloud, doesn't just echo through hallways. It settles in hearts. It burns in systems. It wakes the ones who stopped asking questions. For days, the nation didn't cheer. It didn't clap. It didn't riot. It simply paused. A strange kind of silence followed, not fear, not confusion, but reflection. Because what Jasmine Crockett did wasn't just about a document or a DNA test. It was about a principle that had been quietly dying, that power doesn't excuse you from truth, and that silence isn't always peace. People didn't know whether to call it justice, rebellion, or accountability. But one thing was certain: they felt it. In offices, in courtrooms, at kitchen tables. At bedtime, parents were asked questions they never thought children would care about. Can someone rich lie forever? Do powerful people take tests like we do? The country, in its stillness, had been forced to grow up. But the lesson wasn't about Trump. It wasn't about a marriage contract or a secret mother. It was about what we choose to protect and what we're willing to bury just to feel safe. Jasmine didn't destroy a family. She exposed the price of building one on conditions. And when the documents hit the ethics committee desk, they weren't flames, they were mirrors. Because behind every sealed envelope in Washington, there are voices gagged by contracts. Behind every classified stamp, there's often just shame hiding in a suit. In classrooms, teachers turn the hearing into a civics discussion. Not about scandal, but about duty. One student stood up and said, "So if someone lies in court, they get punished. But if someone lies before court exists, they get protected?" And no teacher could answer that without pausing. In the silence, a new kind of lesson formed. Laws are only as moral as the people writing them. Truth is only as strong as the person brave enough to say it out loud. Jasmine never spoke of Barron again, never said his name, never speculated. Because the story was never about him, it was about the system that tried to turn him into a symbol, a distraction, a pawn. She didn't weaponize a child. She disarmed a lie. And in doing so, she reminded the world that protection isn't about shielding people from hard truths. It's about preparing them to live inside of them. Quiet strength, not noise. For those watching from the margins, from immigrant mothers, single fathers, whistleblowers, foster youth, this wasn't a political saga. It was a spiritual one. It said, your silence has weight, but your voice has fire. That even when money builds walls, documents don't burn in every back room. Someone always remembers. Someone always photocopies. Someone always passes the truth forward like a lifeline. The human cost of truth isn't small. Jasmine knew that. She paid it with every smear, every threat, every closed door in the weeks before. But she never asked for armor. She asked for clarity. And clarity in a country addicted to noise is rebellion. She didn't need applause. She needed integrity. That's why she never looked into the camera, never winked, never gave sound bites. Her fight was never televised for fame. It was recorded because the truth demanded witnesses. In the months that followed, staffers began quoting her, not on social media but in court filings, internal memos, ethics complaints. I wasn't elected to protect someone's reputation. I was elected to protect the truth. That sentence didn't trend. It tattooed itself in government hallways. It reminded people that their job isn't to protect institutions from embarrassment. It's to prevent those institutions from collapsing under unchecked power. Genevieve Larson, once silenced, found herself invited not to TV studios, but to speak at universities and shelters. She didn't cry for attention. She read her letter, over and over, and at the end she would always add, "Truth costs you, but lies bury you." She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a victim. She was a witness who refused to stay invisible. And in that refusal, she reminded millions that bravery doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be honest. One day, a janitor who worked in the Capitol for 32 years stood outside Jasmine's office and stared at the quote on the door. He said nothing, just stared, then walked away. That was the impact. Not applause, not headlines, just wait. Truth, when delivered right, doesn't explode. It settles, and it stays. The final lesson was never written in a report. It wasn't summarized in a hearing. It was left behind in every room Jasmine entered after that. A sense that silence is no longer neutral, that passivity is no longer safe, that I didn't know is no longer enough. We now live in an era where trust has to be earned, not assumed, where privacy must never be abused as a hiding place, where institutions must remember that justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it's legacy destroyed. Jasmine Crockett didn't just read documents. She rewrote the expectation of what leadership looks like. You can wear lipstick and drop subpoenas. You can cry in private and still speak like steel in public. You can lose support and still win history. And maybe that's what frightened people most. Not that Jasmine knew the truth, but that she wasn't afraid of what it would cost her. Because when someone leads with nothing to gain but clarity, they become impossible to control. In the end, there was no parade, no confession, no final twist, just accountability, standing in the open. And maybe that's what we've needed all along. Not a hero, not a villain, but a flashlight, a reminder that power is not about how much you can hide. It's about how much you're willing to let be seen. The echoes of truth lingered, but echoes alone don't change lives. What matters is how we act when everything is on the line. We all carry truths no one else should have to carry alone, though we pretend they don't matter. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Genevieve Larson isn't for politicians. It's for everyday people. People who work graveyard shifts, who don't expect their lives to be perfect, just honest. Because honesty isn't easy. It doesn't dish handshakes or applause. It asks you to risk comfort, to speak when everyone else is silent. And that's why you should act now. Acting doesn't mean you need a podium. It starts small. Wear honesty like a badge to your workplace. If you see something unethical, don't cover for it. Whisper it, report it. Keep copies, documents, receipts. Let accountability be your habit. Choose truth publicly, not just privately. That's how you turn individual bravery into systemic change. You don't need influence, you just need integrity. If you're in a family that whispers not to expose embarrassing facts, break that cycle. Silence protects shame. But speaking truth builds respect. Your children may roll their eyes at your courage, but they'll remember it. They'll adopt it. Because the world doesn't need louder voices, it needs clearer ones. It needs those who choose clarity, even when clarity costs them comfort. We must demand transparency from institutions. Schools, businesses, nonprofits, they all thrive in daylight. Speak up when things look off. Demand relayed statements match records. Ask questions. Be relentless. If your complaints go ignored, escalate. Not for vengeance, but for integrity. We don't just wait for the law to change. We insist that norms change. Because laws follow culture. Culture shifts when citizens refuse to normalize deception, even behind closed doors. Be courageous online too. Not just scrolling, Post facts, share policies, push back on misinformation, but don't weaponize, document before indicting, learn context, quote sources, build evidence, not just opinions. Your reputation depends on trust. Build it with consistency. When someone named Jasmine or Genevieve faces attacks online, step in not to fight the trolls, but to highlight the record. Be louder about facts than rumors. If you're in a workplace whistleblowing situation, don't go it alone. Use internal protocols, but also external ones. Regulatory bodies, human rights organizations. Document steps. Build a file. Copy documents. Store them securely. There's strength in having backups. Jasmine didn't leak. She delivered documents, sealed and final. That's the difference between chaos and credibility. Your voice should never be your only weapon. Let the evidence do the speaking too. Encourage localized ethics audits. Town councils, school boards, HOA committees, they all hold power. They collect money. They make rules. Yet they often face no scrutiny. Get involved. Attend meetings. Request records. Ask tough questions. Don't let action be postponed until scandals hit the national stage. Integrity begins at the margin. When your neighborhood demands truth, systems respond. Support legislation that prevents gag clauses from muzzling truth in family law, settlement agreements, or corporate contracts. Advocate for bills that protect whistleblowers, limit sealed settlements, and ensure transparency in government ethics. Use Jasmine's courage as a model, not just to admire, but to mobilize. Write your representative, sign petitions, share policy proposals. Don't let the phrase, "not my job," stall justice. Show compassion to survivors who have lived with secrets. When someone tells you something hard, listen. Thank them. Believe them enough to act, but gently. Support them when they choose to step forward. Hold space. Don't pressure them to choose controversy. They already carry that burden. Validate their courage, because sometimes the strongest thing they can do is say, "I'm ready," and you'll be there to help them carry it. Grow a personal narrative built on transparency. Don't invest in reputations that demand silence. Invest in legacies that demand truth, no matter the heat. At home, say what you think. At work, challenge norms. In relationships, honor boundaries with honesty. Ethics isn't a checkbox, it's daily choice. It's small saying no to dishonesty. It's choosing clarity when a lie is easier. It's being the flashlight, not the firework. The final lesson: bravery isn't how loudly you can shout. It's how much truth you can hold when everyone else looks away. It's how you sink into honesty even when it isolates you, or costs you friends, or shakes your sense of belonging. Because in the end, systems crumble or they clean up, but only if people refuse to let them hide. Jasmine didn't need to broadcast victory. She delivered evidence, and it changed everything. You don't have to be a public figure to do the same in your circle. Just be unwavering. So go home tonight and ask yourself, what truth have I covered so it's quieter? What question have I avoided asking because of fear? What silence have I agreed was safer than justice? You don't need permission to begin. You just need courage and a record. Start there. Because institutions bleed truth one document at a time. And our communities only heal when courage becomes contagious. But what mattered more than the past was what came next. She didn't go back to the cameras. She didn't return to the press pit. Jasmine Crockett walked straight down the marbled corridor of Capitol Hill, past gold-framed portraits of men who had always believed the truth would never catch up to them. This time, it did. And as her heels echoed like a gavel against the floor, something shifted not in the walls but in the air itself. A storm had been contained for decades. Jasmine wasn't the storm. She was the lightning strike that split it open. Inside her office, a group of interns waited in silence. They had watched it all unfold on the internal monitors, their coffee cups untouched, their phones forgotten. One stood up and asked with trembling voice, "What happens now?" Jasmine didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the people walking below, some unaware, some still in shock. Then she turned. "Now," she said, "now we don't go back to normal. Now we go forward with fire." By midnight, legal analysts were scrambling to explain the implications. Ethics committees reopened dormant protocols. Whistleblower protections were reinforced with actual teeth, but something deeper began to bloom at bus stops, in diners, in school pickup lines. Conversations that were once whispered became open. Did you see it? Did you hear what she said? Do you think it's all true? But the real shift wasn't in what people believed, it was in what they no longer accepted as silence. In Houston, a single mother who had spent years fighting a custody case she was never meant to win stared at her television, tears in her eyes. "She did it for us," she whispered. In Indiana, a high school teacher paused his lesson on constitutional law and rewrote the board. "Truth is not treason." And in a veterans clinic in West Virginia, a man who had never trusted politics again after the Iraq hearings clenched his fist and muttered, "That woman has steel in her soul." Genevieve Larson, once buried beneath silence, now received hundreds of letters not of pity, but of gratitude. Some from mothers, some from daughters, some from women who had signed papers they were forced to pretend never existed. She didn't respond to all of them, but she read every single word. And one night, with her hands trembling, but her voice clear, she walked into a support group meeting and said, "My name is Genevieve. I have a son, and I chose not to be silent anymore." But the most unexpected ripple came from the very place that had tried to bury her Trump Tower. An unnamed employee leaked a document dated 2005, an early draft of a legal addendum striking the paternity clause from a prenup. It had been removed after 47 seconds, but it had existed. And now it was in the hands of the Department of Justice. Someone once said power protects power, but Jasmine's team had another phrase etched into their whiteboard: paper burns, data doesn't. And the youth owe the youth. At UCLA, students painted a mural overnight of Jasmine standing not with a microphone, but a flashlight pointed at the Constitution. At Howard University, law students reenacted the hearing as part of a final project, an entire generation, learning that legal language could be more than a cage. It could be a weapon for truth. In Arkansas, a 14-year-old girl submitted a speech for civics class titled, "The Day the System Flinched." Then came the policies. A bill titled the Larson Amendment was drafted, requiring all federally funded institutions to report paternity claims involving elected officials within 30 days or face defunding. No more sealed faxes. No more private settlements under the banner of national security. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't erase the past. But it was a start. And a start, as Jasmine reminded everyone, was more dangerous to the powerful than 1,000 endings. Still, for all the noise, Jasmine kept quiet. No interviews, no book deals, no tour, just her staff, just her work, just her walk through the same hallways, with the same badge, but now, with different eyes on her. Some respected, some resented, but none ignored, and that was enough. Until one day a young Capitol intern stepped into her office, notebook in hand, visibly nervous. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "I was wondering if you had any advice." She looked up, setting aside her folder. "Advice for what?" He swallowed. "For when you're in a room where everyone wants you silent." Jasmine smiled, not the TV smile, not the political grin, but the one that came from fire earned, not gifted. She stood slowly, walked to the board behind her desk, and wrote in bold ink, "If you were born with a microphone, learn to listen before you use it, because the truth doesn't come with an edit button." And then she turned to him. "That's your first lesson. Your second?" She leaned in. "Silence isn't neutrality, it's compliance. Speak wisely, but never stop speaking." He nodded. And that was it. No applause, no fanfare. Just another day in the office of the woman who had walked into a chamber of shadows and turned on the lights. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.